January 17th, 1943, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The rain falls in sheets across the jungle canopy, each drop exploding against broad leaves like miniature artillery. In a makeshift prisoner collection point near Henderson Field, a Japanese soldier sits with his back against sandbags, still warm from the afternoon sun. His uniform, once the proud khaki of the Imperial Army, hangs in tatters, stained dark with mud and blood that might be his own. He cannot remember when he last ate. His hands tremble, not from fear now, but from exhaustion so complete it has become a kind of numbness. He expects the blade. He expects the rifle butt. He expects what his officers told him would come if he allowed himself the ultimate dishonor of capture. Instead, an American Marine approaches with something in his hands, something that steams in the tropical air, a cup of coffee. The soldier stares at it, uncomprehending, as if the Marine has extended a hallucination made solid. The ceramic cup, chipped at the rim, institutional white beneath the brown stain of 1,000 previous fillings, trembles in the American's hand. "Go on," the Marine says, though the Japanese soldier understands no English. The gesture needs no translation. The soldier takes the cup, drinks, and in that moment, between one sip and the next, everything he believed about his enemy begins to collapse. This is not the story of a battle. This is the story of an idea dying in a prisoner's throat, one bittersweet mouthful at a time. The architecture of honor. To understand what happened in that collection point, we must first understand what brought the Japanese soldier to believe his capture meant certain death. The architecture of Japanese military indoctrination in the Pacific War was constructed on a foundation older than the conflict itself, rooted in the Bushido tradition, the way of the warrior, but twisted by the militarist government into something more absolute, more demanding, and infinitely more lethal to the men who believed in it. The Japanese military code, formalized in the 1941 Senjin-kun, the Field Service Code, was unambiguous in its instruction to soldiers. "Do not live to experience shame as a prisoner," it commanded. "By dying, you will avoid leaving behind the crime of a stain on your honor." This was not merely suggestion. It was catechism. From the moment a conscript entered basic training, the message was reinforced through ritual, through story, through the careful construction of an identity that left no space for the concept of honorable surrender. To be captured was to cease to be human. To become Horyo, prisoner, was to become Kirai, ghost, a thing without name, without family, without existence in the eyes of the emperor and the divine nation. But the indoctrination went deeper still. Japanese soldiers were taught explicit lessons about the nature of their enemies, lessons designed to make surrender unthinkable, not merely through shame, but through terror. American soldiers, they were told, were savages who tortured prisoners for sport. They would mutilate captured men, extract confessions through unspeakable means, parade them as trophies before executing them in ways designed to maximize suffering. Chinese prisoners, their officers said, were routinely bayoneted. Filipino captives were starved and beaten. Why would the Americans, the British, the Australians be any different? The West, after all, had demonstrated its cruelty through centuries of colonial domination. The logic seemed airtight. Better to die fighting, or to take one's own life with a grenade held to the chest, than to fall into enemy hands. This belief was reinforced by the actions of the Japanese military itself. Japanese forces in China had committed atrocities on such a scale that they became synonymous with brutality. The rape of Nanking in Bian-Sichuan 1937 left between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners dead, victims of systematic murder, rape, and torture. Japanese soldiers who witnessed or participated in such acts could easily imagine that their enemies would reciprocate in kind. The psychological projection was complete. We do this to them, therefore they will do this to us. Surrender became not just dishonorable but suicidal. The grenade pressed to one's stomach was mercy compared to what awaited in enemy hands. By 1943, when American forces began capturing Japanese soldiers in meaningful numbers during the Guadalcanal campaign, U.S. intelligence officers estimated that fewer than 1 in every 100 Japanese soldiers would allow themselves to be taken alive. The rest fought until killed or took their own lives. Those who were captured were often wounded so severely they could not resist, unconscious, or so delirious from starvation and disease that they could not execute themselves. These men expected death. They expected torture. They expected everything their training had promised them. What they did not expect was coffee. The moment of contact. The first Japanese prisoners taken on Guadalcanal arrived at American positions in a state of psychological shock that went beyond the trauma of combat. Marine reports from early 1943 describe men who flinched at every movement, who refused to make eye contact, who trembled uncontrollably even after receiving medical treatment. Some wept. Others sat in rigid silence, waiting for the inevitable. Medical corpsmen noted that prisoners often refused water at first, suspecting poison. They would not eat offered food, believing it contaminated. The assumption was universal. This kindness is a prelude to cruelty, a psychological torture designed to make the eventual brutality more exquisite. Then came the cigarettes. An American intelligence officer, Captain James Gannon, stationed at the Henderson Field Processing Center, recorded his observations in a report that would later be circulated among Pacific commanders. "The prisoners are universally astonished when offered tobacco," he wrote. "Many refuse at first, clearly expecting some form of trick. When pressed to take it, and when they observe Americans smoking the same brand, they accept with visible confusion. The effect is immediate and profound. The rigid defensiveness softens. Some begin to weep again, but differently, not from fear, but from what appears to be emotional overwhelm." The cigarettes were American brands, Lucky Strikes, Camels, Chesterfields, packaged in colorful paper that itself seemed like a kind of magic to men who had been subsisting on a few grains of rice per day. Japanese military rations in the later stages of the Guadalcanal campaign had collapsed entirely. Soldiers were reduced to eating grass, tree bark, and in some cases, the flesh of their dead comrades. The average Japanese soldier evacuated from Guadalcanal weighed less than 90 pounds. Against this backdrop of near starvation, the casual abundance of American tobacco, handed out freely, without ceremony, as if such plenty were unremarkable, represented a cognitive dissonance so severe that some prisoners simply could not process it. But it was the coffee that truly broke through. Coffee was not a luxury in the American military. It was a staple, brewed constantly, consumed in quantities that seemed absurd to men from a nation where such things had been rationed since 1940. The Americans had coffee in the morning, coffee in the afternoon, coffee at night. They had coffee during bombardments. They had coffee, it seemed, because the sun had risen, and they gave it to their prisoners as casually as they drank it themselves. A Japanese naval officer, Lieutenant Toshio Yamada, captured near the Matanikau River in late January 1943, later described his first cup in testimony given during the post-war occupation. "I believed I was dead," he said. "I believed that what I was experiencing was some transitional state before final judgment. Then the American gave me something hot to drink. It was bitter, but not unpleasant. He sat down beside me and drank from his own cup. He did not watch me like a guard watches a prisoner. He sat like a tired man taking a rest. I could not reconcile this with what I had been taught. I began to suspect that either I had been lied to or I was experiencing something unprecedented in the history of warfare." The psychological impact of such small gestures cannot be overstated. For men conditioned to expect torture, any deviation from that expectation created a crack in the edifice of their indoctrination. The coffee was not just a beverage, it was evidence. Evidence that the Americans were not the demons of propaganda. Evidence that surrender might not mean death. Evidence that everything they had been told was, at minimum, incomplete. The interrogation that wasn't American military intelligence in the Pacific faced a unique challenge. Unlike German or Italian prisoners, who surrendered in sufficient numbers that interrogation techniques could be refined through practice, Japanese prisoners were so rare in the early years of the war that each one represented an intelligence windfall. Yet traditional interrogation methods, based on European models of pressure, isolation, and psychological manipulation, proved not just ineffective, but counterproductive when applied to Japanese captives. The breakthrough came through accident and necessity. In February 1943, a Marine intelligence unit at Guadalcanal found itself overwhelmed with prisoners after a successful night raid. With insufficient guards and translators, the unit improvised. Prisoners were given food, medical care, and were allowed to rest together rather than being isolated. The results astonished the Americans. Within hours, prisoners began volunteering information. They drew maps. They described unit strengths, defensive positions, supply situations. They did so not under duress, but seemingly out of a compulsive need to reciprocate the unexpected humanity shown to them. The psychological mechanism at work was complex. Japanese soldiers had been taught that capture meant they were already dead in the eyes of their nation. Their families would be told they died in battle. Their names would be erased from family registers. They had, in effect, ceased to exist. This spiritual death created a strange freedom. If they were already ghosts, what loyalty did they owe to the army that had abandoned them? If their nation considered them dead, what treason could a dead man commit? But there was something more. The small acts of kindness, the coffee, the cigarettes, the medical attention, created what psychologists would later term reciprocal obligation. The Americans had given when they could have taken. They had shown mercy when cruelty was expected. This violated the zero-sum calculus of total war so completely that it demanded explanation. And the explanation many prisoners arrived at was that perhaps, just perhaps, the Americans were not fighting for conquest or sadism, but for something else. Something the prisoners had no name for, but which manifested in this casual abundance, this willingness to share even with enemies. A report compiled by the Office of War Information in mid-1943 noted, "The most effective method of obtaining intelligence from Japanese prisoners is to treat them exactly as we would wish our own captured soldiers to be treated." This is not mere humanitarian sentiment. It is practical psychology. The Japanese soldier expects brutality and is prepared for it. He has no psychological defense against kindness. The report went further, documenting specific cases. A captured Japanese sergeant from the 38th Division, when offered a meal of rice, canned meat, and coffee, broke down completely. He asked his translator why the Americans were being kind to him. The translator, a Nisei intelligence officer named Daniel Inouye, replied simply, "Because that's what we do." The sergeant provided detailed information on Japanese defensive positions that proved crucial in subsequent operations. But more significantly, he expressed a sentiment that would be echoed by hundreds of other prisoners. "I was taught you were demons. I see now that we were the demons. Or perhaps there are no demons. I cannot reconcile what I believed with what I am experiencing." The propaganda war within news of the treatment of prisoners spread slowly through Japanese lines on Guadalcanal, carried by whispers and rumors that contradicted official narrative. Japanese soldiers finding American propaganda leaflets, dropped by aircraft or left in abandoned positions, began to read them with less immediate dismissal. The leaflets, prepared by Nisei translators who understood the cultural context, did not promise luxury or comfort. They promised something more modest and, therefore, more believable. You will be treated according to international law. You will be given food, water, and medical care. You will not be tortured. The Japanese command recognized the danger immediately. Orders went out to company and battalion commanders. Any soldier caught reading enemy leaflets was to be executed immediately. The penalty for discussing surrender, even hypothetically, was death. The prohibition extended to speculation about American treatment of prisoners. The edifice of indoctrination required constant reinforcement because the cracks were spreading. Yet the evidence continued to accumulate. Japanese soldiers occasionally captured American positions and found, among the supplies, the remnants of prisoner rations. They found medical supplies clearly labeled for prisoner care. They found, in one case, a notebook belonging to an American medic that contained sketched instructions on how to communicate with wounded Japanese prisoners who spoke no English. "Show them the Red Cross," the notes read. "Use gestures to indicate you're going to help them. Give them water first. They're always dehydrated." The cognitive dissonance created by such discoveries was profound. If the Americans were planning to torture prisoners, why prepare medical care for them? If they intended to execute captives, why waste food and supplies? The internal logic of the propaganda began to collapse under the weight of material evidence. A Japanese diary, recovered from a soldier killed in action near Cape Esperance in April 1943, contained an entry that captured this psychological conflict. "I do not know what to believe anymore. We are told the Americans are barbarians, but I have seen their cigarettes in the hands of prisoners who returned under truce to bury our dead. They seemed healthy. They did not bear marks of torture. My lieutenant says this is a trick, that the Americans show mercy only when they have something to gain. But what do they gain by feeding men who can tell them nothing? I am afraid, but not only of death. I am afraid that everything I believed might be a lie." The mathematics of abundance, the material disparity between American and Japanese forces on Guadalcanal was staggering. But it was not merely quantitative, it was philosophical. The Americans fought from an assumption of abundance. They assumed there would be more supplies, more ammunition, more food. If a position ran low, resupply would come. This assumption shaped everything from tactical decisions to the treatment of prisoners. If food was abundant, why not feed prisoners? If cigarettes were plentiful, why not share them? The Japanese fought from an assumption of scarcity. Every bullet had to count. Every grain of rice was precious. Soldiers were expected to subsist on minimal rations and, when those ran out, to continue fighting anyway. The idea of wasting food on prisoners was incomprehensible, not because of cruelty, but because of a different calculus of resource management. In an army where soldiers were starving, feeding prisoners seemed irrational. That the Americans did so, routinely, without apparent concern, revealed an economic capacity that Japanese soldiers found almost frightening in its implications. Consider the numbers. The average American combat soldier on Guadalcanal consumed approximately 4,000 calories per day from military rations. These rations included not just rice or bread, but canned meat, chocolate, coffee, sugar, cigarettes, and sometimes even luxury items like chewing gum. The Japanese soldier, by contrast, was allocated 2,500 calories per day in theory, but received far less in practice. By late 1942, most Japanese units on Guadalcanal were receiving fewer than 500 calories per day. Starvation and disease killed more Japanese soldiers than combat. A captured Japanese supply officer, when shown an American field kitchen in operation, reportedly stood in silence for several minutes before asking, through a translator, "How can you afford this war?" The question cut to the heart of the matter. The Americans could afford this war because their industrial base produced such vast quantities of material that abundance, not scarcity, defined their military culture. The same factories that had produced consumer goods for a nation of 130 million people had converted to war production without serious disruption to civilian food supplies. The Americans fighting on Guadalcanal ate better than Japanese civilians at home. This abundance extended to prisoners. The Geneva Convention required adequate food and medical care for POWs. But the American interpretation of adequate was shaped by their own military standards. Japanese prisoners received rations nearly identical to what American support troops ate. From the Japanese perspective, this was incomprehensible. Why feed prisoners so well? The answer, when prisoners learned it, was almost as unsettling as combat itself. Because America could. Because the nation's productive capacity was so vast that feeding prisoners represented no hardship. Because in the American conception of war, even enemies retained a baseline of human dignity that required acknowledgement. The conversations that changed minds as the number of Japanese prisoners increased through 1943 and 1944. The U.S. military established formal prisoner-of-war camps throughout the Pacific and eventually in the United States itself. In these camps, away from the immediate pressures of combat, more complex interactions between captors and captives became possible. What emerged was a kind of ideological dialogue conducted not through formal debate, but through daily observation. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Japanese prisoners worked in agricultural details alongside American guards. They observed American soldiers receiving packages from home, cookies, letters, photographs. They saw the casual relationship between officers and enlisted men, so different from the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Army. They noticed that American soldiers complained openly about their officers, about the food, about the war itself, and suffered no punishment for doing so. This was perhaps the most shocking revelation, that dissent did not equal treason in the American conception of military service. A Japanese prisoner named Hiroshi Tanaka, a former schoolteacher conscripted into the army, later wrote about his time at Camp McCoy. "I asked my guard why he did not punish the soldiers who complained," he wrote. He laughed and said, "It's a free country." I did not understand what he meant at first. Then I realized he was saying that even in the army, even during war, there was a space for individual opinion. This was alien to everything I knew. In the Imperial Army, to question was to invite death. Here, it seemed, to question was simply to be human. The guards at American POW camps were often older men, unfit for frontline combat, or wounded soldiers recovering before return to duty. They brought with them none of the combat hatred that might have made them cruel. Instead, they brought a kind of bored pragmatism. They played cards with prisoners who knew the games. They shared cigarettes during breaks. They showed photographs of their families and looked at photographs of prisoners' families in turn. These small human exchanges, repeated daily across hundreds of camps, slowly dismantled the propaganda edifice that had convinced Japanese soldiers their enemies were demons. The coffee ritual became particularly significant in these camps. Morning coffee call became a shared experience, with prisoners and guards drinking from the same urns. The democratic nature of the beverage, identical for guard and prisoner, reinforced the message that American abundance was not just material, but conceptual. Everyone deserved coffee. Everyone deserved adequate food. Everyone deserved basic dignity. These were not rewards for good behavior, but baseline conditions of existence. The letters home that never arrived under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war had the right to send letters home. The U.S. military facilitated this, establishing procedures for prisoners to write to their families. What American administrators did not fully understand at first was that most Japanese prisoners did not write home. They could not. Their families believed them dead. To write would be to reveal the shame of capture, to burden their loved ones with the knowledge that they lived in dishonor. Yet some did write. These letters, most of which never reached Japan due to Japanese military censorship, have survived in American archives. They reveal the psychological journey from indoctrinated soldier to something more complex, men struggling to reconcile what they believed with what they experienced. One letter, written in April 1944 by a prisoner at Camp Livingston in Louisiana, reads, "Mother, if this reaches you, please know that I am well. I have dishonored you by allowing myself to be captured, and I accept whatever judgment you and Father must make. But I must tell you something that troubles me greatly. The Americans have not tortured me. They have fed me. They have given me medical care for the wounds I received in battle. They have even given me books to read. I do not understand this. We were taught they were cruel, but I have experienced only kindness. I fear I have fought for something I did not fully understand. I fear we have all fought for something we did not understand. Please forgive me. The letter was returned, marked addressee not found. A polite fiction, meaning the Japanese Postal Service refused to deliver it. But it remains in the archives, one of thousands like it. Testaments to a transformation that propaganda could not prevent and ideology could not contain. The symbolic weight of small things, if there is a single object that encapsulates the psychological transformation of Japanese prisoners. It is not the rifle or the flag, but the ceramic coffee cup. That chipped, institutional white cup, stained brown, heavy in the hand, still warm from brewing, became for many prisoners the physical manifestation of a conceptual earthquake. It represented abundance where scarcity was expected. It represented sharing where hoarding was the norm. It represented, in its mundane ubiquity, a worldview so foreign to Japanese military culture that it could not be adequately explained, only experienced. In post-war interviews, former Japanese POWs consistently mentioned coffee when asked about their captivity. Not the battles, not the surrender itself, not even the news of Japan's ultimate defeat, but coffee. The daily ritual of morning coffee call, the bitter taste, the warmth, the casual way Americans treated it, as if hot beverages were a human right rather than a luxury. These small, repeated experiences accumulated into a larger understanding. The Americans were not fighting merely to defeat Japan, but to preserve a way of life characterized by abundance, individual dignity, and what they called freedom. The cigarette played a similar symbolic role. In Japanese military culture, tobacco was rationed, controlled, used as a reward for good behavior. In American culture, it was casual, ubiquitous, shared freely even with enemies. The act of offering a cigarette to a prisoner became a kind of liturgy, repeated so often that it became, for prisoners, synonymous with American identity itself. Years later, in post-war Japan, former POWs would sometimes describe Americans not as victors, but as the people who gave us cigarettes. This seemingly trivial description carried enormous weight. It meant the people who recognized our humanity even when we did not recognize theirs. The price of compassion. The American policy of treating Japanese prisoners humanely was not universally popular among frontline troops. Marines and Army soldiers who had witnessed Japanese atrocities, the torture and execution of captured Americans, the mutilation of wounded soldiers, the booby-trapping of aid stations, often felt that kindness to Japanese prisoners was a betrayal of their fallen comrades. Some frontline units were known to take few prisoners, claiming that Japanese soldiers had attempted to escape or made hostile movements. The military leadership recognized this tension and addressed it through a combination of strict orders and pragmatic argument. Orders came down from General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters and from Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Fleet Command. Prisoners would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, period. Officers who violated this policy would face court-martial, but the orders were also accompanied by practical reasoning. Every prisoner was a source of intelligence, and the best intelligence came from prisoners who believed they had been treated fairly. A Marine colonel, speaking to his battalion before an operation in 1944, reportedly told his men, "I know what you've seen. I know what they've done to our boys. But when you take a prisoner, and you will take prisoners, you will treat them right. Not because they deserve it, because we are Americans, and that's who we are. The day we start acting like them is the day we lose what we're fighting for." This was the moral calculation at the heart of American policy, that the treatment of enemies was a measure of national character, not enemy worthiness. It was an idealistic position, difficult to maintain in the face of combat brutality, but it was maintained nonetheless, imperfectly but persistently. The coffee and cigarettes were not just tools of interrogation. They were assertions of identity. The transformation of belief by war's end. Approximately 40,000 Japanese soldiers had been captured by Allied forces in the Pacific, a tiny fraction of the millions who served, but each one a story of ideological transformation. Post-war surveys of these former prisoners revealed a consistent pattern. The vast majority reported that their beliefs about Americans had been fundamentally wrong. They had expected demons and found humans. They had expected brutality and found something approaching mercy. This transformation was not instantaneous or complete. Many prisoners struggled with shame and guilt for years after the war. The Japanese government's initial refusal to acknowledge prisoners' existence meant that many could not return home immediately after Japan's surrender. They remained in Allied camps, in bureaucratic limbo, neither prisoner nor free citizen. During this period, many participated in education programs designed to prepare them for repatriation to a democratic Japan. They read about the new constitution, about universal suffrage, about freedom of speech and press. They discussed these concepts over coffee, still plentiful, still freely given. One prisoner, a former lieutenant named Saburo Ishikawa, later became a journalist in post-war Japan. In 1960, he published a memoir of his captivity titled The Cup of Understanding. In it, he wrote, "I hated Americans because I was taught to hate them. I feared Americans because I was taught to fear them. But when I sat with an American guard and drank coffee from the same pot, I could not sustain that hatred. The coffee dissolved it, one bitter sip at a time. I do not mean this metaphorically. I mean it literally. The physical act of accepting food and drink from a person makes it difficult to see them as inhuman. The Americans understood this, I think, or at least they acted as if they understood it. They fed us not just to keep us alive, but to remind us, and perhaps to remind themselves, that even in war, humanity is possible." The echo across decades, the story of Japanese prisoners and their unexpected treatment by American forces is not merely historical curiosity. It speaks to fundamental questions about ideology, indoctrination, and the limits of propaganda. The Japanese military had created a comprehensive system designed to prevent surrender and demonize the enemy. This system was reinforced through every level of military culture, from basic training through combat operations. It was supported by the state, by religion, by tradition. It should have been unbreakable. And yet it was broken. Broken not through counter-propaganda or ideological argument, but through small acts of decency. Coffee, cigarettes, medical care. These things were not revolutionary in themselves. What was revolutionary was their casual abundance, their apparent everydayness in American military culture. They revealed an economic and political system capable of sustaining material plenty even during total war. And that revelation was more powerful than any propaganda leaflet could have been. In the decades after the war, as Japan transformed from enemy to ally, some former prisoners of war played unexpected roles in building the new relationship. They had seen American democracy not in theory, but in practice, in the daily operations of POW camps, in the treatment of enemies, in the way abundance was shared rather than hoarded. They became, in a sense, ambassadors of understanding, though few would have described themselves in such grand terms. They simply remembered the coffee, the cigarettes, the casual kindness of exhausted guards, and they remembered how those small things had changed everything. Epilogue. The taste of truth return. Now to that prisoner collection point on Guadalcanal. January 1943. The rain has stopped, leaving the jungle steaming in the late afternoon heat. The Japanese soldier still holds his coffee cup, now empty. The ceramic is cool in his hands. He looks at the Marine who gave it to him. A boy, really, maybe 19 years old with a sunburned face and tired eyes. The Marine is smoking, sitting on a supply crate, looking at nothing in particular. The prisoner does not speak English. The Marine does not speak Japanese. But something has passed between them in that exchange of coffee, something that required no translation, a recognition, perhaps, that the propagandists on both sides had been wrong, that the enemy was not a demon but a young man far from home, fighting for reasons he probably didn't fully understand, hoping to survive, drinking the same bitter coffee under the same tropical sun. In the vast machinery of war, the battles and the strategy, the victory and the defeat, such moments seem insignificant. A cup of coffee, a shared cigarette, a brief rest from killing. History barely notices them. But for the men who experienced them, these moments were tectonic. They were the moments when ideology collided with reality and reality won, when the careful construction of hatred met the simple fact of human decency and could not survive the encounter. The prisoner sets down his cup. The Marine nods at him, a minimal acknowledgement. Rain begins again, gentle this time. Tomorrow there will be more war. Tomorrow the killing will resume. But tonight, in this collection point somewhere between battle and whatever comes after, the prisoner knows something his officers never told him. He knows that his enemy can show mercy. He knows that abundance is real, not propaganda. He knows that the world is larger and more complex than his training allowed him to imagine. He knows, finally, that he has survived, not just the battle, but the lie that sent him into it. And somewhere in that knowing, in that quiet moment over an empty coffee cup, the Japanese Empire loses one more soldier, not to death or even to capture, but to the simple, devastating realization that everything he believed was wrong. That the Americans were not demons. That surrender was not the end. That there was still coffee in the world and men willing to share it, even with their enemies. This is how empires fall. Not just through military,